December 21, 1968. Ho Chi Minh Trail, Laos, Route 92, approximately 20 miles west of the North Vietnamese border. 32 Soviet-built ZIL-157 trucks, loaded with ammunition and supplies destined for communist forces in South Vietnam, roll south through jungle darkness. The convoy commander, Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thieu, rides in the lead vehicle, monitoring progress by moonlight. His drivers navigate without headlights, following memorized routes and the truck ahead. The convoy maintains strict light discipline. No cigarettes, no flashlights, no visible illumination that might attract American attention. Thieu checks his watch. 2300 hours. 4 hours of darkness remain before dawn, forces the convoy off the trail into camouflaged hiding positions. 4 hours to cover 40 kilometers. The schedule is tight but achievable. North Vietnamese Army doctrine treats night movement as sanctuary. American aircraft dominate daylight skies over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, engaging convoys with ordnance and napalm, rendering daytime movement suicidal. But darkness changes everything. American jets require visual acquisition or radar guidance to deliver fire effectively. Neither works well at night against dispersed ground targets moving beneath jungle canopy. Surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery positioned along the trail engage American aircraft attempting night operations, forcing them to higher altitudes where precision becomes impossible. For 3 years since American bombing campaigns against North Vietnam began, nighttime has belonged to truck convoys like Thieu's. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies move south after sunset, sustaining communist operations in South Vietnam despite American air superiority. At 2300 hours on this December night, Lieutenant Thieu's convoy passes a distinctive bend in the trail, marked by a damaged bridge, partially repaired with logs. The trucks slow, navigating carefully across improvised planking. Thieu hears his radio operator report position to headquarters in North Vietnam. All proceeds according to plan. The convoy maintains formation, spacing vehicles 50 meters apart to minimize vulnerability if American aircraft somehow locate them in darkness. 3,000 feet above Lieutenant Thieu's convoy, Major James Keller pilots AC-130A Spectre 696568, banking slowly in a left-hand orbit that keeps the aircraft's left side pointed toward the ground below. Major Keller cannot see the convoy with his eyes. Darkness obscures everything beneath the aircraft. But in the cargo compartment behind him, Technical Sergeant Richard Hayes watches a small television screen displaying a low-light image of Route 92, enhanced electronically to compensate for minimal ambient illumination. The screen shows vehicles moving south, their shapes clear despite darkness, their spacing precise. Hayes counts 32 trucks and marks their positions on his tactical display. Next to Hayes, Airman First Class Michael Torres monitors a forward-looking infrared sensor that detects heat signatures from truck engines, distinguishing them from surrounding jungle despite complete visual darkness. The convoy appears on Torres's screen as bright thermal shapes against a cooler background, unmistakable, targetable. Major Keller receives targeting information from his fire control officer, calculates the orbital parameters required to maintain constant weapon alignment on the convoy, and establishes a smooth left turn at 130 knots airspeed. Below, Lieutenant Thieu's convoy continues moving, drivers unaware of the aircraft circling overhead. The C-130 operates far above the effective range of most anti-aircraft artillery deployed along the trail. Its 4 turboprop engines produce sound that dissipates before reaching ground level at 3,000 feet altitude. No searchlights probe the darkness seeking the aircraft. No radar locks onto it. The gunship's orbit confuses targeting solutions that work against jets making single high-speed passes. The AC-130 remains effectively invisible to North Vietnamese forces below. At 23:14 hours, Major Keller receives authorization to engage. 4 20mm M61 Vulcan cannons, mounted along the aircraft's left side, open fire. delivering 6,000 rounds per minute combined rate toward the convoy below. Tracer rounds streak downward, appearing to ground observers as continuous streams of fire emerging from empty sky. The ordnance finds the lead truck with precision, calculated by the fire control computer. The vehicle's fuel tank ruptures, spilling diesel that ignites. The truck behind it swerves, attempting to avoid the burning vehicle, and crashes into trees lining the trail. 4 7.62mm miniguns join the engagement, adding another 24,000 rounds per minute to the fire directed at the convoy. Additional trucks suffer hits, tires shred, engines fail, cargo ignites. Lieutenant Chiu exits his damaged vehicle and runs toward the jungle, seeking cover from fire he cannot locate. He sees no aircraft, hears no distinctive sound of jets, observes only tracers descending from darkness. His anti-aircraft crews attempt to return fire, pointing ZPU-4 quad machine guns toward the tracer's apparent origin, but their rounds dissipate harmlessly into night sky. The AC-130 orbits beyond their effective range, adjusting its circle slightly to avoid the defensive fire, continuing to deliver ordnance on convoy vehicles that remain stopped or attempt to maneuver. The engagement lasts 15 minutes. When the gunship departs, low on ammunition, scheduled to return to base, 19 trucks burn along 2 kilometers of trail. 13 vehicles remain intact, but cannot proceed past the disabled convoy. The route is blocked until recovery crews clear wreckage, a process that will consume days. Lieutenant Chiu survives. He later tells intelligence officers that his convoy encountered a ghost in the sky. They saw nothing, heard nothing, yet fire came from darkness everywhere. His description matches hundreds of similar reports from North Vietnamese forces who encounter AC-130 gunships during night operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans, it appears, have built an aircraft that owns the night. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft doctrine in 1968 emphasizes visual acquisition and tracking. Gunners train to spot aircraft against daylight sky, follow them with optical sights, deliver fire based on calculated lead angles, accounting for aircraft speed and direction. Radar-guided systems exist but remain scarce. The Soviet Union provides limited SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, enough to defend key facilities in North Vietnam, but insufficient to cover the entire Ho Chi Minh Trail network. Most anti-aircraft positions along supply routes rely on visual observation, whether daylight or aided by searchlights at night. This doctrine works adequately against American jets conducting conventional operations. F-4 Phantoms, F-105 Thunderchiefs, A-4 Skyhawks all make high-speed passes lasting seconds, deliver ordnance, and depart before sustained anti-aircraft fire can adjust. Gunners defend positions by saturating likely approach paths with fire, hoping to connect with aircraft moving too fast for precise tracking. Night operations doctrine builds on this foundation. North Vietnamese planners recognize that American aircraft effectiveness decreases dramatically after sunset. Jets require visual acquisition of targets or radar guidance to achieve precision. Visual acquisition fails in darkness. Pilots cannot see trucks or supplies beneath jungle canopy even in daylight, much less at night. Radar guidance systems available to American forces in the mid-1960s struggled to distinguish ground vehicles from surrounding terrain clutter. Consequently, American air operations concentrate on daytime hours when visual identification enables accurate engagement. This creates a predictable pattern that North Vietnamese logistics exploit ruthlessly. The Ho Chi Minh Trail strategy depends on nocturnal movement. Trucks depart staging areas in North Vietnam and Laos at sunset, travel through darkness along routes that wind through mountains and jungle, and reach hiding positions before dawn. During daylight hours, vehicles remain concealed beneath camouflage netting or natural canopy, engines cold, personnel resting. American reconnaissance aircraft photograph the trail constantly, searching for targets, but properly camouflaged vehicles blend invisibly into surrounding vegetation. When darkness returns, movement resumes. This pattern enables North Vietnam to sustain supply operations despite American air superiority. Intelligence estimates suggest that by 1968, 15,000 trucks operate along the Ho Chi Minh Trail network, moving 100 tons of supplies south daily. The majority of this traffic occurs at night when American air power remains largely impotent. North Vietnamese confidence in nighttime sanctuary rests on several years of successful experience. From 1965 through early 1968, American attempts at night interdiction achieve limited results. Fighter bombers occasionally locate convoys using flares, but the illumination persists only briefly, allowing single passes before darkness returns. C-47 gunships, early conversions armed with side-firing miniguns, operate at night with some success, but lack sophisticated sensors, relying on visual acquisition aided by flares or vehicle lights. Clever convoy commanders maintain strict light discipline and disperse when they hear aircraft engines, minimizing vulnerability. Most convoys reach their destinations successfully. Losses occur, but remain acceptable given the strategic necessity of supplying communist forces in South Vietnam. Then, in late 1967, something new appears in the night sky above the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Convoys begin suffering attacks from invisible aircraft that deliver sustained fire with uncanny accuracy. Survivors report tracers emerging from darkness, continuing for minutes rather than seconds, finding vehicles regardless of evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft fire seems ineffective. The attacking aircraft remains beyond visual range, unaffected by defensive measures that work against jets. Intelligence officers collect reports, trying to understand the new threat. By early 1968, they identify the aircraft as AC-130 Spectre gunships, but understanding what the aircraft is doesn't provide solutions for countering it effectively. The AC-130 Spectre represents an evolution in American gunship concepts that began with primitive conversions of transport aircraft during early Vietnam operations. The United States Air Force recognized that standard fighter bombers, optimized for speed and single-pass engagements, proved poorly suited for close air support missions, requiring sustained presence over battlefields. Transport aircraft, with their long loiter times and substantial cargo capacity, offered potential for conversion into dedicated fire support platforms. Initial experiments mounted side-firing weapons in C-47 cargo aircraft, creating the AC-47 Spooky gunship. These conversions proved effective but limited. The C-47 lacked speed to avoid determined anti-aircraft fire and couldn't carry sophisticated sensor systems. The C-130 Hercules offered a superior platform. Larger than the C-47, powered by 4 Allison T56 turboprop engines producing over 13,000 horsepower combined, the Hercules could carry heavy weapon systems and advanced electronics while maintaining enough speed and altitude to survive in contested airspace. In 1967, the Air Force initiated Project Gunship 2, converting C-130A transports into AC-130A Spectre gunships. The conversion installed 4 20mm M61 Vulcan cannons along the left side of the aircraft fuselage, each capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute with rotating barrels that sustained high fire rates without overheating. 4 7.62mm GAU-2A miniguns augmented the Vulcan cannons, adding 24,000 rounds per minute combined. All weapons fired through the left side of the aircraft, requiring the pilot to fly a left-hand orbit that kept the target area continuously on the left side throughout the engagement. But weapons represented only half the revolutionary capability. The sensors integrated into the AC-130 enabled night operations that previous aircraft could not achieve. Forward-looking infrared systems detected heat signatures from vehicle engines, personnel and fires, displaying thermal images on screens that sensor operators monitored. Low-light television amplified available ambient illumination, moonlight, starlight, creating visible images in conditions that appeared completely dark to unaided human eyes. Later variants added laser designators and analog fire control computers that calculated weapon aiming solutions, accounting for aircraft altitude, speed, wind conditions, and target movement. These systems transformed night from impenetrable barrier into operational environment, where American forces achieved capabilities impossible for adversaries lacking equivalent technology. The AC-130A carried ammunition loads that enabled sustained operations. 3,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition fed the Vulcan cannons, enough for 30 minutes of continuous fire at combat rates. 10,000 rounds supplied the 7.62mm miniguns. Later variants, including the AC-130H introduced in 1972, modified the weapon mix to include two 20mm cannons, two 40mm Bofors automatic cannons, and a single 105mm howitzer, the same artillery piece used by ground forces, adapted for airborne employment. The 105mm gave gunships capability to engage hardened targets like bunkers and bridges that resisted smaller caliber weapons. Ammunition capacity for the H model included 256 rounds of 40mm and 100 rounds of 105mm, still substantial loadouts enabling extended missions. The crew operating an AC-130 numbered 13 to 14 personnel, each performing specialized functions essential to mission success. 2 pilots managed flight operations, maintaining the precise orbit required for accurate fire. A navigator plotted courses and coordinated with ground commanders requesting fire support. The fire control officer supervised weapon employment, calculated targeting solutions, and authorized engagements. Sensor operators monitored infrared and television displays, identifying targets and tracking their movement. Gunners loaded weapons, managed fire rates, and cleared malfunctions. The flight engineer monitored aircraft systems. The illuminator operator controlled searchlights and flares for situations where visual illumination became necessary. Every crew position interdepended. Sensors located targets. Fire control calculated solutions. Pilots maintained orbit. Gunners delivered ordnance. Coordination required extensive training, emphasizing night operations specifically. Development timelines reflected urgent operational requirements. Project Gunship 2 began in 1967, and the first AC-130A deployed to Southeast Asia in 1968. Lockheed and Rockwell handled conversions, modifying C-130A transport airframes with weapon systems, sensors, and fire control computers. The process transformed cargo aircraft carrying troops and supplies into precision fire support platforms capable of sustained night operations. Initial deployments proved the concept immediately effective. By mid-1968, AC-130s established presence over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, beginning the systematic interdiction campaign that North Vietnamese forces could never adequately counter. The primary mission AC-130 gunships undertook in Vietnam focused on Ho Chi Minh Trail interdiction, disrupting North Vietnamese supply convoys moving south through Laos and Cambodia. Typical missions followed established patterns. Gunships departed bases in Thailand or South Vietnam after sunset, flew to assigned patrol sectors along the trail network, and established orbits between 3,000 and 7,000 feet altitude. At these altitudes, most anti-aircraft artillery positioned along the trail could not reach the aircraft effectively, while sensors still detected vehicles and personnel below. Missions lasted 3 to 4 hours depending on fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure, allowing gunships to loiter over target areas far longer than jets could manage. Typical engagement sequences began with sensor operators scanning assigned sectors for thermal signatures or movement. When operators detected a convoy, they marked target locations and reported to the fire control officer. The FCO calculated targeting solutions using the analog fire control computer, accounting for aircraft altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and target position. The pilot established the orbital pattern required to maintain weapon alignment on targets continuously. Once all parameters aligned correctly, the FCO authorized engagement and gunners opened fire. Weapons engaged targets sequentially, often starting with 7.62mm miniguns to gauge accuracy, then shifting to 20mm Vulcans for greater destructive effect. The pilot adjusted the orbit based on tracer observation and sensor feedback, walking fire across convoy vehicles or concentrating on specific targets requiring sustained attention. During the Tet Offensive in early 1968, AC-130 gunships provided critical fire support for Marine positions at Khe Sanh Combat Base. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the base, attempting to overrun defensive positions through sustained ground operations. Gunships orbited above Khe Sanh nightly, engaging North Vietnamese forces attempting to infiltrate American lines under cover of darkness. Sensor operators detected personnel movement invisible to ground defenders, directed fire precisely on infiltration routes, and disrupted operations that depended on darkness for concealment. The fire support proved decisive. Marines defending Khe Sanh credited gunship operations with preventing successful large-scale assaults that might have overwhelmed defensive positions. Commando Hunt 7 operations during 1971 and 1972 demonstrated AC-130 effectiveness against the Ho Chi Minh Trail logistics network systematically. Intelligence coordinated gunship patrols with reconnaissance data, identifying high-traffic sectors and vehicle staging areas. AC-130s interdicted over 10,000 trucks during this period, according to Air Force records, based on sensor observations and damage assessments. Each interdicted truck represented supplies not reaching communist forces in South Vietnam. Ammunition not fired, food not consumed, weapons not distributed. The cumulative effect constrained North Vietnamese offensive capabilities measurably. Steel Tiger operations targeted supply routes through Laos specifically, areas where North Vietnamese forces concentrated logistics efforts away from heavier defenses, protecting routes through North Vietnam proper. Gunships disrupted these operations significantly, forcing North Vietnamese planners to adapt logistics strategies. Instead of running large convoys that sensors easily detected, they dispersed movements into smaller groups traveling separately. This adaptation required more trucks to move equivalent supplies, slowed transit times, and increased vulnerability to other American interdiction methods. The adjustments represented success from the American perspective, forcing adversaries to expend more resources for reduced effectiveness. North Vietnamese forces attempted various countermeasures against AC-130 operations. They increased anti-aircraft artillery deployment along the trail, concentrating guns near critical choke points where routes crossed rivers or mountains. They deployed SA-2 surface-to-air missiles in limited numbers, hoping to engage gunships at altitude. They dispersed convoys when aircraft sounds suggested American presence overhead, attempting to complicate targeting. They experimented with decoy heat sources, controlled fires that resembled vehicle thermal signatures, trying to waste gunship ammunition on false targets. None of these measures succeeded in neutralizing the AC-130 threat effectively. Anti-aircraft artillery struggled against orbiting gunships maintaining position at 3,000 feet or higher. Visual acquisition in darkness proved nearly impossible. Gunners saw only tracers descending, tried to calculate aircraft position from tracer origin, and fired hopefully toward estimated locations. But AC-130s adjusted orbits constantly, and tracers created optical illusions about range and position. Defensive fire rarely achieved hits, and when it did, the damage usually remained insufficient to down the aircraft. SA-2 missiles designed to engage fast-moving jets at high altitude proved less effective against slower targets like C-130s at medium altitude, especially when the target maneuvered unpredictably. Convoy dispersion slowed supply operations without eliminating vulnerability. Dispersed trucks remained individually targetable to sensors capable of detecting single vehicles. The cost North Vietnamese logistics operations absorbed from AC-130 presence became substantial. Estimates suggest supply flow along the Ho Chi Minh Trail decreased 30 to 40% during periods of intensive gunship operations. This forced North Vietnamese planners into impossible choices: either accept reduced supply deliveries to forces in South Vietnam, reducing operational tempo and offensive capability, or attempt daytime convoy movements that exposed vehicles to the full spectrum of American air power, including fighter bombers much more destructive than gunships. Either choice disadvantaged communist operations significantly. AC-130 loss rates remained remarkably low given the intensity of operations, and the duration missions required aircraft to remain over hostile territory. 6 AC-130s were lost in combat during Vietnam operations, 5 to anti-aircraft artillery, and 1 to an SA-2 missile. Against 18,000 combat sorties conducted from 1968 through 1973, This represents a loss rate below 0.04% per sortie. Extraordinary survivability for aircraft operating nightly over heavily defended territory. The low loss rate validated design choices: altitude operations above effective anti-aircraft range, sensor-based targeting, eliminating need for visual acquisition that would require lower altitudes, sustained orbits enabling persistent presence, without exposing aircraft to successive defensive engagements. Airmen who crewed AC-130s during Vietnam operations consistently described the experience as unlike conventional flying. Sensor operators watched infrared screens for hours, hunting thermal signatures among jungle and mountain terrain. They describe it as hunting from an invisible platform. Targets never knew the aircraft was present until ordnance arrived. Pilots maintained precise orbits for extended periods, requiring smooth control inputs and constant attention to airspeed and bank angle that kept weapons aligned correctly. Gunners loaded ammunition continuously during engagements, managing fire rates to prevent barrel overheating while maintaining effective fire on targets. Every crew member understood that mission success depended on coordination. Sensors found targets, fire control calculated solutions, pilots positioned the aircraft, gunners delivered ordnance. Failure in any role compromised the entire engagement. The technology gap between American AC-130 capabilities and North Vietnamese countermeasures defined the unequal nature of night operations over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Forward-looking infrared sensors and low-light television gave American crews vision in conditions where North Vietnamese forces remained effectively blind. The sensors detected vehicles, personnel, and equipment through darkness, beneath cloud cover, in weather conditions that grounded visual-dependent aircraft. North Vietnamese forces lacked equivalent sensors. Their observation capabilities remained limited to unaided human vision, occasionally aided by searchlights that betrayed positions to American aircraft. This fundamental asymmetry meant AC-130s operated with near impunity once crews learned to avoid known heavy anti-aircraft concentrations. Tactical advantages compounded technological superiority. AC-130 gunships orbited outside effective anti-aircraft artillery range for most engagements, maintaining altitude sufficient for safety while keeping sensors within effective detection range for ground targets. Darkness that concealed convoys from visual observation did nothing to hide thermal signatures from infrared sensors. The sustained orbital pattern allowed continuous fire adjustment based on sensor feedback. If initial fire missed, crews corrected aim and re-engaged within seconds. North Vietnamese forces designed air defenses for jets, making single high-speed passes, not aircraft loitering overhead for hours, delivering precise fire continuously. Doctrine mismatches prevented North Vietnamese forces from developing effective counters, even when they understood AC-130 capabilities theoretically. Their air defense networks optimized for different threats: fast jets at high altitude or medium altitude, aircraft making rapid ingress and egress. Gunships operated differently, slower than jets, at medium altitude, in sustained orbits over relatively small areas. Countering this required different defensive approaches. Surface-to-air missiles capable of engaging maneuvering targets at medium-altitude anti-aircraft artillery, with sophisticated fire control enabling accurate engagement of orbiting aircraft in darkness, or interceptor aircraft capable of night operations against slow targets. North Vietnam lacked most of these capabilities. SA-2 missiles existed in limited numbers and proved less effective against C-130s than against jets. Anti-aircraft artillery could theoretically engage orbiting targets, but required either radar guidance or visual acquisition. Neither worked reliably against gunships operating at night. North Vietnamese Air Force MiG fighters occasionally attempted intercepts, but lacked night fighting capability comparable to American standards. Industrial capacity differences showed clearly in sustained operations. The United States built and deployed 28 AC-130 gunships during the Vietnam era. Despite losing 6 aircraft in combat, production continued, losses were replaced, and operations never ceased due to insufficient aircraft. North Vietnam could not match this capability. They lacked the industrial base to develop equivalent sensor systems, the computer technology to create fire control solutions, or the manufacturing capacity to produce purpose-built gunship aircraft. Even if they had captured an AC-130 intact and studied its systems, replicating the technology would have required industrial and technological capabilities North Vietnam did not possess. Ultimately, North Vietnamese forces accepted nighttime convoy vulnerability as a constraint they could not eliminate. They continued operations despite AC-130 presence because strategic necessity demanded supply flows to the south. They adapted tactics to minimize losses, better dispersion, faster transit times through known gunship patrol areas, increased anti-aircraft coverage at critical points. But they never resolved the fundamental problem that American technology had negated their most important tactical advantage: the cover of darkness. The strategic impact of AC-130 operations along the Chi Minh Trail reverberated through North Vietnamese military planning for the remainder of the war. Logistics officers faced impossible calculations: how many trucks to risk, which routes to use, what speed to maintain, balancing rapid transit against fuel consumption. Every convoy became a gamble. Some would reach destinations successfully. Others would encounter gunships and suffer crippling losses. The uncertainty constrained offensive planning in South Vietnam. Commanders could not rely on receiving supplies on schedule. They built additional buffer stocks, dispersed caches, and developed contingency plans for shortfalls. All of this consumed resources and reduced operational flexibility. Modern AC-130 variants continue operations in 2025, 57 years after the first Spectre gunships deployed to Vietnam. The AC-130U Spooky, AC-130W Stinger II, and AC-130J Ghost Rider incorporate technology advances unimaginable in 1968. GPS-guided precision munitions, advanced electro-optical and infrared sensors, sophisticated electronic warfare systems, digital fire control computers, processing engagements orders of magnitude more complex than analog predecessors handled. The 105mm howitzer remains, now supplemented or replaced by precision-guided bombs and missiles that strike from higher altitudes against more sophisticated air defenses. But the core concept persists unchanged: a cargo aircraft modified with side-firing weapons, orbiting targets, delivering sustained precision fire in support of ground forces. Technology evolution changed employment somewhat. Modern air defenses specifically address slow-moving orbiting targets that AC-130s represent. Surface-to-air missiles with sophisticated guidance systems can engage gunships effectively at the altitudes Vietnam-era aircraft operated. Consequently, contemporary AC-130s operate primarily in permissive or semi-permissive environments where air defenses are suppressed or absent. They support counterinsurgency operations, special operations missions, and ground force engagements against adversaries lacking sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities. The niche Vietnam-era gunships filled, interdicting supply routes defended by modest air defenses, no longer exists against peer adversaries with modern systems, but against non-state actors, insurgent forces, and adversaries lacking integrated air defenses. AC-130s remain as effective as they were over the Ho Chi Minh Trail decades earlier. The psychological effect AC-130 operations created among North Vietnamese forces who survived encounters lasted long after the war ended. Veterans consistently cite the gunship as the most feared American weapon system they faced. More than fighter bombers delivering heavier ordnance, more than B-52 strategic bombardment, more than ground artillery. The invisibility factor proved critical to this fear. Fighter bombers could be seen approaching, heard before they struck, tracked during attacks. B-52s dropped ordnance from extreme altitude, but gave warning through the sound of falling objects. Ground artillery followed predictable patterns. Incoming fire came from directions defenders could identify and potentially counter. AC-130 fire emerged from darkness without warning, continued relentlessly, adjusted to counter-evasive measures, and came from aircraft that remained invisible and apparently invulnerable to defensive fire. The psychological stress of facing an enemy you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot effectively engage, produces anxiety that conventional visible threats do not generate. Alexei Kuznetsov, a North Vietnamese truck driver who survived 3 encounters with AC-130 gunships during 1971 convoy operations, later described the experience to historians as fighting ghosts. "We knew death circled overhead, but saw nothing until comrades' trucks burned." His description captures the essential horror gunship operations created. Warriors throughout history have faced visible enemies, however terrifying. North Vietnamese forces along the Ho Chi Minh Trail faced an enemy they could not see employing capabilities they could not match. Courage and determination remained insufficient against technological superiority of this magnitude. The story of AC-130 Spectre gunships over the Ho Chi Minh Trail illustrates how technological advantage creates capabilities that adversaries cannot counter through tactics, training, or determination alone. North Vietnamese forces were not cowardly. They continued operations despite knowing gunships patrolled the darkness. They were not incompetent. They developed sophisticated logistics networks that sustained operations for years under constant American air interdiction. They simply lacked the sensor technology, fire control systems, and industrial capacity to develop equivalent capabilities or effective countermeasures. American investment in infrared sensors, low-light television, analog computers, and purpose-built gunship conversions created capabilities North Vietnamese forces had no means to match or neutralize. The AC-130 program demonstrated principles that remain relevant decades later. Technology that provides vision where adversaries remain blind creates decisive advantages. Sustained presence over battlefields enables precision fire impossible for brief engagements. Specialized platforms designed for specific missions often prove more effective than general-purpose aircraft adapted temporarily. And perhaps most significantly, psychological effects of facing invisible, apparently invincible capabilities can prove as militarily significant as physical destruction achieved. North Vietnamese forces planned to own the night. They built logistics strategies around the assumption that darkness provided sanctuary from American air power. They moved supplies at night because American aircraft proved ineffective after sunset. The strategy worked successfully for years. Then America built an aircraft that owned the darkness. Forward-looking infrared gave American crews vision North Vietnamese forces lacked. Low-light television turned night into day on sensor screens. Side-firing weapons delivered sustained precision fire from invisible platforms circling overhead. North Vietnamese forces never developed effective counters. They adapted tactics, accepted losses, and continued operations because strategic requirements demanded it. But they never owned the night again. North Vietnam planned to move supplies under cover of darkness, safe from American air power. America built aircraft that made darkness irrelevant and owned the night completely.